Sorry, I accidentally hit something. Sorry, I accidentally hit something. I'm not going to redo the video. Um, how well do we know Pumpkin Tits? Pretty well, it would seem, but nobody has ever accused the outgoing president of possessing a complex personality. His behavior in office confirmed the common view, barely disputed even by his allies, that he is a shallow, narcissistic prick, blind or indifferent to common decencies with poor impulse control and a vindictive streak. His futile attempt to litigate away electoral defeat may appall you, but it probably doesn't surprise you at all. Still, just because we know bad things about the 45th so-called president, don't assume that there's nothing bad left to find out. Journalists like to pretend that we know everything about a president in real time, but our information is never close to being complete, and there's always more to learn, and it's seldom reassuring. Americans really had no idea after he left office how completely Woodrow Wilson depended on his wife Edith after he suffered a stroke in September of 1919. She waited 2 decades to admit in her memoirs that, on instructions from Wilson's doctors, she was the one that winnowed his written communications with cabinet members and senators, digesting and refraining in tabloid form that those things had to go of those things that had to go to the president. Nor did any Americans learn until a decade after his death that John F. Kennedy, a much less devoted family man than Life magazine let on, he shared a mistress sequentially, if not concurrently, with the Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, with whom the CIA recruited in one of several harebrained plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Then there's Richard Nixon. Americans knew many shameful things about Nixon thanks to the Watergate scandal that prompted his resignation. But only after he left office did we learn, for instance, that Nixon ordered an aide to compile a list of Jewish people who worked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics so that he could demote them. Nixon represents the gold standard and post-presidential shockers, and decades after he left the Oval Office, gasp-inducing revelations from his White House tapes and other documents continue to stream forth. As recently as September, the Princeton political scientist Gary Bass revealed that the squatter who engineered a 1971 tilt in the U.S. foreign policy away from India and toward a repressive junta in Pakistan told aides that he found Indian women sexually repellent. India at the time was the rare nation led by a woman, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Gandhi had angered Nixon by strengthening India's ties to the Soviet Union as she prepared to go to war with Pakistan to support a rebellion in East Pakistan, which later became the independent nation of Bangladesh. At the time, it was abundantly clear that Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had judged Pakistani's slaughter of Bengalis to be a Cold War sideshow, but Americans had to wait half a century to discover the psychosexual component of Nixon's cold-blooded realpolitik. Undoubtedly, the most unattractive women in the world are the Indian women. This is what Nixon can be heard saying in a tape recording from June of 1971 that the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum released in response to Bass's declassification request. The most sexist. No, I'm nothing these people. I mean, people say, what about the black Africans? Well, you could see something there. The vitality there. I mean, they have a little animal-like charm, but God, those Indians are basically fucking pathetic, he said. This was no momentary lapse. During a break in November of 1971, the summit with Gandhi, Nixon returned to the topic saying, "To me, they turn me off. How the hell do they turn other people on? Henry, tell me." And finally, this gem worthy of serious historical analysts, they were repulsive, and it's just easy to be tough with them. Nick Kissinger, who's always maintained falsely that he discouraged Nixon's bigoted rants, can be heard in these tapes egging him on. But don't blame yourself if you missed the shocking bit of Nixonia when it surfaced a couple months ago. Odds are you were distracted by some other real-time outrage. When a public man is known to say bigoted things out in the open, it's near certain that he's saying even more bigoted things in private. Will we ever hear about these after Pumpkin Tits leaves office? More than likely, yes. Timothy Naftali had said that there's a catch. Naftali, a historian at NYU, was the director of the Nixon Library from 2006 to 2011, and he said that Pumpkin Tits won't likely leave behind a trove as rich as Richard Nixon did because nobody else has. Posterity, Naftali explained, benefited from unreproducible circumstances in Nixon's case. Nixon kept meticulous records, including those famous audio tapes, because he was a dedicated student of history. Pumpkin Tits is not. Nixon presumed, mistakenly, that he could weed appalling things out of the official record because the law gave him ownership and control over his presidential records. What Nixon couldn't know was that a series of court decisions and legislative changes in response to Watergate would change the existing rules. In essence, the government decided that presidential records were the property not of ex-presidents, as they had always been judged before, but of the public. Henceforth, they would be controlled, with certain allowances for personal correspondence, by the National Archives. Every president since Nixon has been mindful, as Nixon was not, that posterity was listening in, though it's hard to imagine right now that there will one day be a Pumpkin Tits library and it will be administered not by Pumpkin Tits himself and his descendants, but by the National Archives. Pumpkin Tits' presumed understanding of the way the game is now played doesn't mean we won't have some capacity to eavesdrop on his administration in recent years, but voice recognition software has made it easier to create near-verbatim transcripts of memcons, or memorandums of presidential telephone conversations made by duty officers in the Situation Room. It was a memcon of Pumpkin Tits' July 2019 conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about investigating Hunter Biden. I would like you to do us a favor, though, that led to his impeachment. Eventually, we'll get to see other Pumpkin Tits memcons, though their release will likely be slowed by the national security claims. With some luck, we'll also get to see raw transcripts produced by the voice recognition software, but those won't be equivalent to the transcripts of the Nixon tapes, because the voice recognition captures not the squatter's voice, but that of the duty officers repeating what he had just heard. Besides, a former staffer on the National Security Council told the Washington Post in September of 2019 that Pumpkin Tits political appointees in the NSC, departing from previous practice, routinely edited out glaringly erroneous or offensive things that the squatter blurted out in conversations with foreign leaders. Now, access to the documentary record will be limited by other considerations, too. Under the 1978 Presidential Records Act, the National Archives may not grant the public access to presidential documents for a period of 5 years. Ex-presidents are given considerable latitude, too much really, to restrict access to certain types of records, including those related to national security and medical matters. But this means that it may be a while before we find out what prompted Pumpkin Tits' unexplained Saturday afternoon visit to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in November of 2019. The White House said it was part of his routine annual physical exam, an explanation that the press immediately concluded was a lie. Another difficulty will be Pumpkin Tits' habit, acquired when he was in real estate, of ripping up documents. At least in theory, this is against the law. For a while, Politico reported Solomon Lardy and Reginald Young Jr., two career White House records and management officials, literally gathered waste paper from the Oval Office and the presidential residence and Scotch taped the presidential residence and Scotch taped the ripped up documents back together. But in the spring of 2018, they were fired abruptly and marched off to the White House grounds by Secret Service agents. We don't know whether any Scotch taping continued after that, and it's very hard, Naphtali noted dryly, to make available a record that doesn't exist anymore. Prosperity does have a few arrows in its quiver, though. The mountain of documents that were produced by the White House, not to mention the other executive agencies, is too great that they can't all be doctored or ripped up. But keep in mind that at least some people working in the White House take their legal duties seriously, or they are angry at Pumpkin Tits for not protecting them against exposure to COVID-19, or they just don't like the fat ass because he treats them like shit. He's never cared about us. Of course he hasn't. Another point in Prosperity's favor is that Pumpkin Tits, for all his talk about loyalty, has never commanded much from the people who work for him, but no visible bonds of affection or respect bind Pumpkin Tits to his employees, leaving fear that the sole motivation for keeping the troops in line. See Michael Cohen. Most of that fear will evaporate by January 20th, by which time the trade publishers may be turning away proposals for tell-all books, at least that they create a market glut, unlike the previous two administrations, which were somewhat difficult for reporters to penetrate. The Pumpkin Tits White House leaked like a sieve. One variable that previous administrations didn't contend with is the non-disclosure agreements that Pumpkin Tits handed out like so much penny candy. Pumpkin Tits has always been a maniac about enforcing his NDAs. He even sued his ex-wife Ivana Trump for violating an NDA and the divorce agreement by publishing a work of fiction, a bodacious ripper titled For Love Alone, that was later turned into a TV movie. The case was settled out of court, but it may give pause to some signatories that this squatter is a billionaire, or at least a multimillionaire who uses drawn-out litigation to bleed his enemies dry. But Benjamin Witz, the editor-in-chief of Lawfare, says he expects that plenty of ambitious young lawyers will be willing to harvest the favorable publicity by representing on contingency or pro bono the many Davids forced into battle with the Pumpkin Tits Goliath. I think there will be a cottage industry, he said. The outstanding questions are too many to count. How close did we come to war with North Korea when Pumpkin Tits threatened to rain fire and fury on Kim Jong-un? After Pumpkin Tits decided instead to become the first squatter to meet with Kim, how close did Pumpkin Tits come to agreeing to remove U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula? Exactly how much revenue did Pumpkin Tits property collect from the federal government during his presidency, and how much from people seeking to influence Pumpkin Tits' residency? Who has received the promises from Pumpkin Tits that they'll be pardoned? Did Pumpkin Tits promise in advance to commute Roger Stone's sentence? What were the domestic arrangements in the Pumpkin Tits White House? Can Melania and Barron really be said to have lived? Could Melanoma and Barron really be said to have lived there, or did they spend more time in the New York apartment or at her parents' house in Maryland, where Barron went to school? And did White House aides observe signs of mental decline in Pumpkin Tits related to aging? Precisely how much money does Pumpkin Tits owe, and how much of it is owed to people or banks linked to Vladimir Putin? Which companies did Pumpkin Tits steer business to, and did he violate any laws in doing so? And what did Pumpkin Tits say in private about the specific white supremacist groups that support him? And what private agreements existed between Pumpkin Tits and his Attorney General Fat Fuck Barr to advance Pumpkin Tits' political interest? And how serious was Pumpkin Tits about trying to buy Greenland? We may never learn the answers to all these questions, but we'll likely learn a lot more than we know now. The only downside is that this will require devoting more of our attention to Pumpkin Tits, something a few of us may have the stomach to even to do just now. But if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Random Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.